Hear me when I say this, the Sabbath might be one of God's most brilliant creations. Here's why. The Sabbath has a past, present, and future component. They all point towards the exact same thing that can be explained in Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2 verse 2, on the seventh day he rested from all his work, then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. Quick interlude, that word God rested translates in the Hebrew to Shabbath, which is where we get the word Sabbath from. And then in Genesis chapter 2 verse 3, God blessed the seventh day and he made it holy. Here's my question, what was so special about that day that God decided to bless it? Two things. Number one, it signifies that God was finished with his entire creation project from the start to the finish. And number two, he was pleased with the works that he had done. So then fast forward into Exodus, where God tells Moses that the Sabbath is going to be the sign of the Mosaic covenant. And observance of that sign is going to let the other generations know that God has made the Israelites holy. There's that word again. Holy. The word actually translates to sanctified, which just means to be set apart, but think about it from a vertical standpoint. So you're elevated, you're set apart from a vertical perspective. Observance of the Sabbath was to teach the Israelites that sin was ultimately the reason why man forfeited the Garden of Eden. But here's the thing, if sin is the reason why you forfeit Eden, the wages of sin is death, then the wages of righteous life is eternal life. So God tells them that the Sabbath is what ultimately allows them to enter into the land of Canaan. Canaan was symbolic for the promised land, and within Canaan, the Israelites were supposed to enter into a place called God's rest. This is the exact same rest that we're talking about here. So if you were an Israelite, the concept of God's rest would have been found in this place called Canaan. And to enter into God's rest, you had to obey the Sabbath. The wilderness is where they received God's commandments. It was a place where they learned about the standard of God. The wilderness is also where they learned about Moses' sacrificial system that would use the blood atonement to cover their sins. So resting in the Sabbath would teach them that their works weren't good enough to qualify them for God's rest. Imagine the other nations looking at the Israelites and realizing that this group of people wasn't working for one day out of the week, yet they were still being supernaturally cared for through a divine providence, purpose, and peace. So if you're familiar with Israelite history, then you understand that the first generation of Israelites never entered into Canaan because they didn't believe. And then the second group of Israelites who entered into Canaan, they never experienced God's rest because they stopped keeping the Sabbath. In other words, they didn't want to be holy, aka sanctified, aka set apart. They made the mistake of thinking that their prosperity did not come from God, but it came from the works of their hand. And because of that, they stopped obeying the Sabbath, which then opened up the door for a bunch of foreign idols. You can honestly make the argument that persecution is not the greatest threat to the believer. It's actually prosperity, because for every 100 believers that can withstand persecution, there's a much, much smaller pool that can actually inherit prosperity